Hi everyone, welcome. Here are the big takeaways from Chapter 8 on bivariate correlational research and Chapter 9 on multivariate correlational research. Both experimental designs and correlational designs are very commonly found in psychological research. So here's the first big takeaway from these chapters. Here's a brief review of the important differences between the two designs. Remember, experimental research designs allow researchers to determine cause and effect between two variables of interest. The distinguishing characteristic of an experiment is the researcher is able to randomly assign participants to each of the comparative groups of the independent variable. Remember, this is called manipulating the independent variable, assigning participants to at least two versions of it, two comparative conditions. Correlational research designs only describe the strength of a relationship between two variables. So we gain the ability to predict the likelihood that two variables occur together in the future. Correlation does not mean causation. That is, it does not mean one variable causes the other. Only an experiment gives us that. Just that the two variables are likely to co-occur in time, in the future, based upon observations of the past. For an example of a useful correlation found, social support is associated with less emotional distress. Social support, having friends and loved ones around you, is associated with less psychological and emotional distress. They correlate with each other. We cannot say that one causes the other, but the research results are useful nonetheless. Knowledge of the correlation here tells us we want to encourage greater social support for people who are struggling in distress, or we often observe people who lack social support struggling more than people who have friends and loved ones surrounding them. Another example of a useful correlation. Financial stress is associated with household conflict and domestic violence, if you've heard that phrase. Financial stress in a household often co-occurs with conflict and violence in the household. They correlate. We cannot say that one causes the other, but the research results are useful. Here, knowledge of the correlation tells us we want to be watchful for conflict in a household where financial stress suddenly arises, like someone losing their job or laid off suddenly. Or when we see marital conflict, researchers have discovered that money and finances are the #1 topic that couples fight about. By the way, number 2 is children. The big takeaway is remember that correlation does not equal causation, but the research results are useful. But correlational relationships are not as valuable as causal relationships, and here's why. Just because two variables co-occur, even if they quite often co-occur, we cannot say that one with 100% certainty that one will always lead to the other or that one causes the other. Psychological scientists pursue that kind of cause and effect clarity as the ultimate goal in advancing psychology as a science. The second big takeaway from this chapters, there are the circumstances under which we're more likely to find a correlational research design than a true experimental design. Number 1, where the researcher cannot manipulate the independent variable or the causal variable. That is, where you cannot randomly assign people to comparative conditions of the independent variable. Number 2, where the researcher cannot always make before and after comparisons. And number 3, sometimes we actually want to study existing groups and simply see how they differ according to some variable of interest to us. For example, psychologists have long studied a relationship between childhood variables and some way in which people differed in their childhood upbringing. This alleged cause of an adult personality characteristic is some past childhood variable, some way in which people differed in their childhood upbringing. Obviously, we cannot assign different people to various childhoods and then wait 2 decades for the results to see how it manifests in their adult personality. Here, the alleged causal variable, one's childhood, already exists. It's an interesting thing to study, but only with correlational means. Correlational research is valuable because it can give us the ability to predict these two variables co-occurring in the future. And finally, the third big takeaway from this chapter, be sure you're able to distinguish between moderating variables and mediating variables. When we're talking about a relationship between two variables, moderating versus mediating, interacting with those two. Moderators or moderating variables split or partition the effect of a causal or predictor variable into subgroups in regard to some outcome variable that we're looking at. For example, we know that the relationship between watching TV violence and a child's subsequent aggressive acts. But gender is a third variable, a moderator here, showing us that boys show this effect more strongly than girls. Boys show a stronger correlation here than girls. Gender is a moderating variable that splits the effect of watching TV violence, so we see different aggressive outcomes depending on whether the participants are boys or girls. Mediators, on the other hand, or mediating variables, they generate the effect through which the causal or predictor variable is able to influence the effect variable. The mediator creates the effect, if it will, between the two. For example, talk therapy tends to reduce stress, right? So a study that says psychotherapy decreases substance abuse is actually assuming that the mediator of stress reduction is the third variable here. And that decreased stress is actually what makes the patient less likely to abuse the substances, less likely to seek out drug use as a coping mechanism. It's not that psychotherapy decreases substance abuse, it's the mediating variable of less stress, so the patient feels they need the substances less. So in summary, the big takeaways from Chapter 8 on bivariate correlational research and Chapter 9 on multivariate correlational research are these. Number one, remember the limitations of correlational research. Correlation does not mean one variable causes the other, just that the two variables are likely to co-occur in time and in the future. Number two, know the circumstances under which we're more likely to see correlational research design than experimental design. And number three, be sure you're able to distinguish between a moderating variable versus mediating variables. Those are the big takeaways, guys, from Chapter 8 on bivariate correlational research and Chapter 9 on multivariate correlational research. Thank you, everybody.